Good afternoon and welcome to the theatre at Parliament House, Canberra. We meet here today where people have met for thousands of years, and I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra region. Pay my respects to the elders past and present of all Australia's Indigenous people. I extend that respect to any Indigenous people in our audience today or watching online. Today marks the 9th annual lecture in honour of the late Harry Evans, the longest serving clerk of the Senate. For those that don't know me, my name's Richard Pye. I'm the current clerk of the Senate. For those who do know me, I'm still Richard Pye. I'm dedicated to that joke. I'm going to keep doing it until I get a laugh. Maybe next year. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to members of the Evans family who are here with us for this occasion. I also acknowledge and welcome some current senators and my predecessor as Senate Clerk, Dr. Rosemary Lang. And the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly of the ACT has also joined us today. Hello, Tom. Time permitting, Scott, this lecture will be followed by a short Q&A session. It's my pleasure to introduce, anyway, and welcome back to Parliament House, this year's presenter, the Honourable Scott Ryan, former President of the Senate. Scott was elected to the Senate to represent Victoria in 2007 and re-elected in 2013 and 2016, as well as serving in several ministerial capacities between 2013 and 2017. He served as the 25th President of the Senate from 2017 to 2021, a period that included the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. From 2021 to 24, he served in Ottawa, as Australian High Commissioner to Canada and is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra. Would you please join me in welcoming the Honourable Scott Ryan to deliver the 2025 Harry Evans Lecture, The Senate in Times of National Crisis.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for that kind introduction. I've always thought those who applaud before they hear a speech are by definition optimists. I'd like to acknowledge firstly the Evans family who I've met today, representing the late Harry here today, to Richard Pye and the Senate staff, to the former clerk, to my former colleague Senator Mackenzie, also a Victorian, and particularly I'd like to acknowledge the work Glenn Ryle did in helping me with some research underpinning this lecture. It is a distinct pleasure and honour to be invited to give this lecture. Before I turn to my substantial address this afternoon, I'd like to pay tribute to Harry Evans. In the words of Michelle Grattan upon his retirement, the Senate's sentinel. If current events tell us anything, it is that history can be too easily forgotten as time passes. So as one of the first former senators to give this lecture without significant direct experience of Harry as clerk, while serving as a senator, minister and president, I want to take this opportunity to restate his unique contribution and directly relate it to the issues I want to raise today. Harry Evans is a giant in the history of our Senate and therefore our Parliament. I have said before that while senators temporarily occupy the Senate and perform our role as elected officials, the staff of the Senate are its custodians. And there was no greater custodian than Harry. Through his writings, his leadership and his advice to staff and senators over 4 decades, and not only but particularly during his time as clerk. As the standing significance and recognition of the unique role of the Senate has grown, a substantial and consistent element of this was provided by Harry. In many ways, he provided the intellectual architecture and framework for the activities and role of the Senate today. In a 2009 piece referencing his predecessor J.R. Odgers, Harry stated, "It is possible to identify long-term trends which have an appearance of inevitability about them. It is also impressive, however, how many significant events were determined by pure chance, particularly the presence at crucial times of somewhat peculiar individuals." Harry is also one of those peculiar people present at crucial times. His times were decades in service of the Senate as an institution, regardless of its composition or the composition of the other place. And as Harry outlined, the history of the Senate itself illustrated its existing role is not inevitable. Now, my own experience of Harry was primarily academic. As a student of federalism and constitutionalism in the 1990s under the late Brian Galligan, someone who shared many of Harry's sentiments, I was introduced to his writings. Whether regarding the Constitution and Parliament, specifically the Senate, or issues of the day such as the 1999 referendum, I recall when first reading Harry, his writing leapt out at me, appealing to my own instincts and sensibilities as much as my first reading of Madison and the Federalist Papers, a source he so often referred to when challenging what he described as the Westminster cringe that is too often used to define our Parliament and how it should operate. His determined arguments against the assumption of Australia as simply a transplanted Westminster, detailing how our constitutional arrangements were different and unique, and his ongoing defence of the independence of the Senate through its separate electoral mandate and differing composition to the House, has profoundly influenced how all senators, and I suggest the public as well, has profoundly influenced how all senators, and I suggest the public as well, view the Senate and its role. I've outlined elsewhere how these have developed a unique opportunity for people to put a government in office, but to paraphrase a former Prime Minister, ensure it does not have untrammelled power. Harry's work ensured that became and remains a feature of our politics, and having served in both parliamentary and executive capacities, I think it gave me a unique insight into its issues he so eloquently and consistently pursued. As High Commissioner, it was a particular privilege to present a copy of Odgers to the then Speaker of the Canadian Senate as a personal gift, who I'd previously met as President myself, and then to follow it with a very long discussion referencing Harry about the differences in both our respective chambers and their role and standing. In his address to the Australian Parliament in 2007, Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper referred to Senate envy in comparing the two chambers from a Canadian perspective, a sentiment I am sure Harry shared. I intend to return to Harry towards the end of this lecture when I consider some lessons and options. So what constitutes a national crisis, particularly with respect to Parliament? In attempting to consider the behaviour and role of the Senate in times of national crisis, this is an important threshold. It cannot simply be the use of rhetoric that occasionally infects politics. I consider the most appropriate test to be one that requires significant alterations to the normal operations of Parliament, in this case, the Senate. So what were the true moments of national crisis and how did they affect the operation of our Parliament? World Wars I and II, albeit for slightly different as well as common reasons. Given the anniversary events next Tuesday, I should briefly explain why I don't consider the events of 1975 to be a national crisis. In short, while extraordinary, events were resolved politically and constitutionally, in the end by an election. And while the aftermath was contested, and indeed we can see it still is, the result was determined electorally. The First World War was a unique test of the new federation, which was still establishing its parliamentary norms and habits. No one foresaw the destruction that would be wrought on a generation and the long-term social and political scars created by bitter debates over participation and conscription. World War II was an existential fight for Australia itself in a way the First World War was not, and sandwiched between them was the economic catastrophe of the Depression, combining economic calamity and its consequent tensions with the political scars of the war. Both of these logically led to changes in parliamentary arrangements, as the unique nature of emergency defence powers constituted a very different approach to government, including fewer sittings of Parliament itself. In the former, the Federal Parliamentary War Committee was instituted from 1914 to 18, an advisory committee comprised of both members and senators, but notably including the Prime Minister, Opposition Leader and Defence Minister. So in one key sense, it was not a normal parliamentary committee as it comprised members of the executive. As well as allowing the committee to provide advice to government, it was also a means of ensuring the Parliament received information about these matters. And for this research, I'm indebted to Dr. Lang's work and previous paper on this. During World War II, several joint committees, previously not as common, were established to cover matters including war expenditure, social security and taxation, amongst others. As Dr. Lang outlined, their purpose, according to Menzies, was to keep parliamentarians in touch with information relating to critical functions, while ever the necessities of war meant the Parliament itself was sitting for much shorter periods and the executive was exercising greater emergency powers. Odgers comments that these committees did much useful work, but they were not reappointed after the war. Secret sittings of Parliament were held, of which there are no formal records, including joint meetings, albeit in the House of Representatives with senators as guests. I'm not sure the Senate would again consent to attending secret meetings in the House of Representatives as occurred in 1942 in lieu of conducting its own, with senators merely being guests and subject to the provisions of the House. Indeed, the lack of records and whether these today would even constitute parliamentary proceedings under the Privileges Act is a question I could not answer, thereby also limiting, potentially, the options for debate of the measures being discussed. There was, however, another influence, the impact of these crises on the view of the Australian Parliament itself. As Dr. Lang has outlined in her Harry Evans lecture, the First World War saw the vision of the operation of Parliament of the inaugural Senate President Richard Baker, quote, overtaken by the dominance of responsible government in the political mix, exacerbated by global events starting in 1914. Richard Bronowski wrote of his grandfather Robert Bronowski's time as a parliamentary officer encompassing both world wars, culminating in his time as Senate clerk. The period was one of experimentation and rapid change, and towards the end of it, an alarming, if temporary, diminution in the powers and influence of Parliament as emergency war powers were invoked. Of all the parliaments of the Dominions and the Congress of the United States, the Australian Parliament sat for the fewest number of days and had the least to do with day-to-day governance. The executive branch of government reigned supreme. One doesn't have to be a sceptic of state or executive power, as I tend to be, to fairly conclude that a consequence of crisis is greater executive discretion in the use of state power and the diminution of the core parliamentary functions of oversight and transparency in its use. This led to the tendency, already underway, for our system to lean towards Bagehot's efficiency perspective on parliamentary government, drawn from Westminster. I share Harry's Madisonian scepticism of this both in theory and practice. It has never been an accurate description of our constitutional and parliamentary arrangements. But in looking to more recent examples, is stating the obvious that the Senate was not the independent chamber that it is now, and this was immediately apparent during COVID-19. Since the 1940s, we have undergone what have been described as crises, economic, political, even so-called constitutional, but I contend none so significant as in 2020 with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, and separately but critically, the reactions and measures adopted by governments in response to it. I won't regale or indeed trigger people with a detailed description of the first few months of 2020. We only need to remind ourselves of the rapidly changing environment and constantly evolving yet uncertain forecasts of risks at the time. When the COVID-19 pandemic was declared, any comparable event was outside living memory for most, if not all, and the impacts on the operation of government and Parliament were unprecedented. Heretofore, unimaginable restrictions were instituted on the most personal human activities and interactions at the community level, and interstate barriers that previously existed only during wartime or the Spanish flu pandemic a century earlier were resurrected. These would have profound impacts on the operation of Parliament at the very time when unprecedented power was being exercised by the elected executive and officials at both the state and Commonwealth levels. At this point, basic assumptions underpinning the very operation of the Commonwealth Parliament, such as attendance, but also including actual participation in the chamber when present, were challenged, restricted, or even under threat. Prior to this, while in preceding years there had been occasional discussions of remote participation in parliamentary proceedings, it had been limited to participation in committees and generally not considered ideal. Part of this was due to the limits of technology itself, but there was also a strong view from most, and significantly most party leaders as well, that attendance for deliberations and proceedings was a crucial element in the conduct of Parliament. But for general and in some cases individual health reasons, as well as the gradual increases on restrictions on movement, this was obviously now challenged. For the Parliament, this meant a rapid move in the direction of remote participation in two senses, the logistical and technological, but also the consideration of procedural requirements. Much of this detail is outlined in the reports of the Senate Committee on Procedure, but in short, a limited form of remote participation was developed. Notably, the Senate and House adopted slightly different rules and procedures to accommodate these requirements, including relating to the rights of participation by members and senators. Specifically, senators were given the right to move amendments or requests for amendments to legislation, a privilege the House did not grant to its members. But crucially for both, remote voting was not allowed or accommodated, reflected by the Senate Committee on Procedure stating, "This reflects a view about the primacy of attendance in the Parliament as the key means for senators to engage in and determine its work." An important step was the institution of a Senate Select Committee, chaired by a senior member of the opposition and with a non-government majority. The purpose of the Senate Select COVID Committee was accountability and transparency. Even if Parliament had been sitting, the extraordinary measures, particularly the financial ones, merited such a committee. But it was notable in that it was created by the government in the opposition in the form that it was, with a non-government majority, unlike standing legislation committees that undertake estimates. The role and expertise of the Senate in these matters was explicitly acknowledged by both government and opposition, but notably also by specific reference in the House of Representatives. In the debate instituting the COVID-19 Select Committee, the leader of the government in the Senate at the time, Senator Cormann, was explicit. It is the Senate that has, of course, the tradition and the expertise in scrutinising the activities of government. And there was explicit acknowledgement of this from the House of Representatives too, through the then Manager of Opposition Business and now Leader of the House, Tony Burke, who I will quote at some length. In the absence of the Parliament, oversight is really important. There will be a Senate inquiry, a committee established to perform a whole lot of that oversight. The Parliament has seen for a long time that while there are joints committees, there are reps committees. The truth is the committee system that has been the most thorough in terms of supervising the work of government has been Senate select committees. That is simply a given. A Senate committee is the strongest way to provide oversight in the absence of the House and Senate sitting themselves. We have come a long way from terms like unrepresentative swill emanating from across Queen's Hall. This restricted approach to remote participation in parliamentary sittings has been criticised by some, but the critical role of the Senate and its committee system has also been recognised in some of the research, with one author noting, Parliament's accountability function was saved from elimination only by the Senate's capacity to install a mechanism for all-party scrutiny of executive decision-making. However, I'm not convinced by the criticism of Harry Hobbs and George Williams that, and I quote, Parliament's failure to adapt during the pandemic is of significant concern, including the lack of remote voting arrangements. It was a conscious decision of the Senate, not the government, that required voting attendance. The fact that other parliaments have alternative arrangements does not invalidate this choice. I've briefly outlined above the majority view that restricted voting to actual presence, and there also remain potential constitutional questions regarding voting while not present. Indeed, some parliaments have seen the opportunity for changes to be much more long-lasting. Canada has allowed remote voting for years after the pandemic ended, leading to the situation where members at public events would ask to vacate the event for a few minutes to vote on their phone in a manner where they may be anywhere in the country. It is difficult to understand how this maintains the role of Parliament as the primary forum for debate and accountability, when as a matter of course, attendance to participate in this most basic function is not required. Finally, I note that much of the research on this topic does not acknowledge, or some of the research on this topic does not acknowledge the greater opportunities for remote participation that the Senate gave its members than the House did, a point I'm sure Harry would also have noted. The fixation on Parliament being seen solely through the prism of the House of Representatives is indeed a long one. However, the research also criticises the limited nature of sittings themselves, and in this I do not think it paints a fair or accurate picture of events at the time. In the initial days of the pandemic, prior to the more extreme interstate movement controls erected by states and territories, senators generally seemed to share the wider community view that some temporary limits were judicious, and this guided the early days of the pandemic. I might also add, in the circumstances, the Senate could have determined to continue to sit itself absent the House, albeit with significant practical difficulties. It chose not to, and absent formal prorogation, this was not within the ability of the government to unilaterally prevent it doing so if it chose. From mid-2020 through to early 2021, the prime reason for difficulties in Parliament assembling were restrictions imposed by states and territories on movement, and the occasional claimed authority of those officials to also restrict members of Parliament from travelling to attend sittings and undertake their work. On numerous occasions, I, as well as the Speaker, had to engage privately, so as not to inflame difficult situations, with state and territory officials to insist upon the right of senators from all parties to undertake specific direct parliamentary duties. Too often this concluded with an almost resigned grant of what was supposed to be seen as a favour. In one instance, an official with whom we were in discussions with about an upcoming parliamentary sitting said words to the effect of, "We have not yet decided whether Parliament can sit." As someone who was far from a supporter of the regime of controls themselves anyway, or their legality or constitutionality, it took some restraint to not point out that officials had no role in making such a determination. What I did politely say at the time was that if that comment was made publicly, it would provoke a serious clash, and it was not in their interests, given their stated desire to maintain public acquiescence in the rules which were already beginning to fray. Compounding this was the larger issue of the inconsistency in the application of the rules. Ministers were being allowed to travel, indeed being granted the then required permits to travel, including to the ACT itself, while rules were being asserted restricting other parliamentarians. One justification offered was that a single traveller posed less risk than a parliament travelling as a whole or part, which may be mathematically true, but it does not mean it is constitutionally or legally so. There was insufficient awareness and in some cases concern with the inherent contradiction between officials determining their or another minister could travel, but they also claimed the power to effectively limit or prevent the assembly of the body to whom that minister was accountable to meet, and on some occasions address the very decisions of these officials. And it was not just impacting government or parliament. On one occasion, an intervention was necessary with one state official to ensure an opposition office holder could attend a secure briefing directly related to their parliamentary duties, but which required travel within their own city that officials determined they were not allowed to undertake. These events raised a very serious issue, and in my opinion, an unresolved one. The right of officials to restrict the movement or work of members of parliament that directly relate to parliamentary proceedings. The restrictions instituted during COVID were in this sense more strict than during world wars. I made a statement to the Senate about these matters after convening in August 2020, and I'll quote from part of it. The right of those elected to attend and participate in Parliament is an ancient one. For good reason, the ability of others, including the executive, to restrict this has always been limited. The ability to scrutinise the executive and participate in legislative activity is unarguably even more critical in times of crisis due to the extraordinary powers being delegated, granted and exercised by officials and the executive. Simple acquiescence to these assertions of control by officials of the executive of the Commonwealth states or territories, including somewhat extraordinarily the territory established as the seat of government that we are constitutionally required to assemble in, poses a risk that we cannot envisage how it may be used or potentially even misused in a future time in circumstances we cannot imagine. I doubt any of us imagined the current circumstances only a year ago. That was in August 2020. The next crisis that impacts the operation of Parliament may well emerge as suddenly as COVID, and I remain of the view that the principles that underpin the effective existence of Parliament and the scrutiny it provides become more essential in any crisis where power is inevitably gathered and exercised in the centre. The precedents set in 2020 and 2021 need to be specifically considered, lest they inadvertently become a starting point for officials or ministers in the future. So what other lessons can be learnt or principles applied from the above examples or potential national crises? In considering lessons, we must return to the nature of Parliament itself and the unique Australian one, the platypus, as one author described it, with the Senate being its defining unique parliamentary element, different from others we are often compared to, whether they be Westminster, New Zealand or Canada. Critically, in considering lessons for the future, our Senate was also, of course, a very different one in the earlier era, in the first half of the century, when I outlined the crises of the two world wars. The most obvious change is, of course, the expansion of Parliament and the change in the electoral system that occurred in 1949. This profoundly changed the nature of the chamber by, for the first time in the modern party era, protecting and institutionalising the role of an opposition beyond the simple operation of staggered Senate terms that had previously only done so temporarily, notably in the lead up to 1914, following the 1929 election and prior to 1943. The effective winner-take-all electoral system prior to 1949 ensured 2 consecutive electoral victories in the House would be reflected, usually in an even more overbearing majoritarian outcome in the Senate. The institution of the modern committee system in the Senate in 1970 represented another significant step in the Senate asserting its independence within the Parliament, and today is one of the most defining features of the chamber and its work. Indeed, it has led to an additional element of constituencies, as I described them, represented within our Parliament, adding to the local and state-based constituencies inherent in the constitutional design of the two chambers. Senators, often through committee work, sometimes over very long periods, develop and represent constituencies or areas of interest or experience that cross local or state borders. The recent history of the Senate contains numerous examples of individual senators who have developed both a profile and expertise in specific issues, often underpinned by the habit of our committees conducting hearings into matters and legislation where citizens and organisations make direct, substantial contributions, not only in Canberra, but right around the country. The change in the method of election and activity of committees has arguably given the Senate greater legitimacy in determining contested legislation, as well as the oversight of government, as it is almost guaranteed that a majority of the Senate entails the expression by its elected members of a majority of the electorate, as well as a geographically diverse one, whereas a House majority usually contains a plurality at best. This difference is compounded by the declining support of the two major parties, and is widely observed that electoral support for the parties of government is in long-term decline. The combined Senate vote, and I'll use parties of government to describe the Coalition and the Labor Party, the combined Senate vote for the two in 1983 was 85%. In 2025, it was 65%. This is also reflected in the House of Representatives, with the combined vote dropping even further from 93% to 66% over the same period. The size of the crossbench has been growing accordingly, first and foremost in the Senate, but in this decade in particular, also in the House of Representatives. Despite minor variances, it seems these long-term trends are likely to continue for the foreseeable future. The crossbench in the Senate is currently 28% of the chamber, while it's only 9% in the House, but this smaller latter figure is still historically large. I mentioned above my doubt that the Senate would acquiesce to the House in future crises in the manner it did earlier this century. The dominance of the House by the executive, a point which Harry made consistently, is its defining feature. But there are elements of it in our current arrangements that deal with matters traditionally dominated by the executive that, in my view, are likely to be considered as models for future development. A unique committee in our Parliament is the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, the PJCIS. It is a statutory joint committee, like others, but with its defining element being the appointment of members remains the effective privilege of the Prime Minister, with the support of the Leader of the Opposition. Despite the requirement that senators appointed are done so by motion moved by the Leader of the Government in the Senate, this position itself is also determined by the composition of the House of Representatives and the decision of the Prime Minister. Now, at the outset, I'd like to say I think the PJCIS has been successful within its existing remit. In particular, acting as a forum for parties of government to negotiate the passage of national security legislation through the provision of information that cannot be widely distributed and can only go to select members of Parliament. In my time, legislation emerged from this committee and was almost always passed through the Senate with the support of the two major parties. But the judicious use of this approach to committees is a key to its success. Through this, and its very narrowly defined oversight role, it has successfully generated a high degree of trust between national intelligence and security agencies and the wider Parliament. That is not automatically the case, as in my time in Canada, I saw their Parliament's equivalent not succeed in either of these roles, in my view to the detriment of both the Parliament and national security more broadly. This success and approach relies on the wider Parliament and particular members of the parties of government essentially deferring key issues of individual judgment about legislation to a smaller select group of their colleagues. And while some of these are senators, they are effectively appointed by leaders of the House of Representatives. Whether this is sustainable as the size of the crossbench in both chambers grows is a question that will increasingly be asked. More importantly, however, is the fact that this committee has a very narrow remit. Unlike its parallels in the United States, it does not have an oversight role including over operations. Our direct executive responsibility and accountability to Parliament is very different to the entrenched executive Madisonian model of the US. Current proposals to establish an equivalent in the defence portfolio represent a significant extension of this approach that extends the PJCIS model into the realm of defence by establishing a similar statutory joint committee with membership effectively determined by the Prime Minister and in a similar manner to the PJCIS. The rationale for this is to, and I'll quote from some of the speeches in the House and the Federation Chamber, oversight of all areas of our defence ecosystem, and is modelled on the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security and provides a mechanism for classified parliamentary intelligence briefings and oversight of defence. It is explicitly modelled on the PJCIS approach and indeed draws upon its success in arguing for its establishment. However, in my view, this is a flawed comparison. The PJCIS deals with agencies that have for many years been outside significant parliamentary scrutiny, particularly with respect to their operations. The institution of the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security reflects this. It has served as a particularly useful forum to discuss and debate changes to national security legislation. However, while sometimes contentious for other reasons, these are not matters of significant resource allocation and its scrutiny that are at the core of Parliament's work, and specifically the Senate. Inevitably, in portfolios as large as defence, the wider Parliament expects a say as well as oversight, as one of the core functions of Parliament is to grant the executive the funds it requires and then scrutinise their use. More money and resources directed to defence inevitably means fewer elsewhere. A committee determined solely by those in or directly seeking executive office via the House of Representatives does not necessarily represent all the interests, experience, insights or views across the Parliament. Furthermore, I suggest the model that the leaders in the House appoint joint committee whose interaction with the wider Parliament is so constrained, is not one the Senate should easily concede more widely than its current operation with the PJCIS, and especially in areas where the Senate has such a strong oversight role through its estimates process. It would do nothing for the Senate's standing, or indeed that of officials either, for questions to be asked at estimates in future years, but for walls to be erected by officials or ministers that another, albeit restricted in membership, joint committee had covered those matters. Harry was concerned with executive dominance, primarily as a result of party discipline. Of course, this exists in the Senate as well as the House, but the Constitution of the Senate almost always guarantees no one party or coalition has a majority. These committees, effectively appointed by party leaders in the House, are a direct extension of the Constitution and forms of the House of Representatives, and they represent a subtle deferral by the Senate to the House in the oversight of government, which, given the Senate's current extensive practice of such, also now acknowledged by the House during COVID-19, is a deferral that should only be undertaken exceptionally rarely. Finally, I note a former colleague commented that membership of the committee should be predicated on support for defence spending. I respectfully disagree. Membership of the committee of the Parliament should not be predicated on a pre-existing worldview. It would have been as inappropriate during COVID as if membership of a Senate Select Committee on COVID was predicated on supporting the measures then adopted by governments around Australia. As an aside, I note that there are ongoing demands to head down a British route and require some form of parliamentary authorisation for deployment of the ADF, and I think it is appropriate for me to address this issue as well. The requirement in the UK is solely within the remit of the House of Commons. I have seen no such suggestion that a demand in Australia would fall solely within the House of Representatives, but nor should it. The very slight difference in powers of the Houses is and should remain solely as outlined in the Constitution. The Senate should never stand for such a significant privilege being granted solely to the House of Representatives. To do so would be to concede a core constitutional principle. That said, I don't propose and I don't support such a requirement for a parliamentary vote, and I'm not convinced that it is necessary. The Parliament, and particularly the Senate, is always free to determine the matters it debates, so it is not necessary for the debate to occur, and I don't believe such a constraint on the executive in these matters is warranted. Putting the proposal for the new committee to one side, one manner in which the Senate could maintain a degree of independence from the necessary work of a committee like the PJCIS is to assert its legislative role through sunset clauses. I have, those who know me, spoken my affection for these more in other places more widely, but I think they have a particular role to play when dealing with the legislative consideration of restricted committees of this type, those where membership is effectively determined outside the Senate and information provided is confidential and limited to those members, albeit for very good reason. For example, I note the current ASIO Amendment No. 2 Bill, 2025, makes certain rarely used powers that were initially granted to ASIO in 2003 and subsequently renewed on multiple occasions due to sunset clauses, it makes them now permanent, albeit subject to review in 3 years. This provision is supported in commentary and submissions, including by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, writing, "These powers, first instituted in 2003, have often been described publicly as a temporary measure only. However, they have been regularly prolonged in 2006, then 2014, 2018, 2019 and 2020. The temporary nature of these powers was an acknowledgement of this and ensured passage through the Senate. Since 2006, the Parliament has consistently acted to retain these powers despite calls for repeal. This demonstrates, rather than temporary powers, these are de facto permanent powers. Rather than continue to pretend otherwise, their status should be definitively addressed." I suggest the logic here is entirely the wrong way round. The renewal of extraordinary powers is not testament to the need to make them permanent. It reflects the parliamentary consideration of both their extreme nature, or extraordinary nature, and their need for review, but also responsible consideration of such having been undertaken and re-endorsed. The regular sunsetting of legislation drawn from closed committees of this nature could be a manner for the Senate to assert its independence while allowing for the necessary confidentiality and restricted nature of such committees. Sunsetting ensures both the executive and officials remain aware of the Senate's independence and its role in determining contested legislation, and in my view also goes a long way to generating community and political consent and acquiescence to controversial issues. They get a hearing. Requiring ministers and officials to make the case that extraordinary powers need to be renewed can drive greater legitimacy. The process itself will generate greater awareness and potentially understanding, even if disagreement, of the rationale for them. A Senate standard, rule or practice along these lines could represent a small innovation to protect Senate autonomy, as these issues increasingly come to the fore in a more contested geopolitical environment. One thing I learnt from my time studying Harry, reading the testaments to his work with senators on accountability measures and then working with Harry's successors myself, is that a little Senate procedure can go a long way. The maintenance and development of scrutiny and accountability is sometimes a product of very small steps. In 1970, I'm not sure they foresaw our current estimates process. In his testament to Harry upon his retirement as clerk, Laurie Oakes, no less than a former schoolmate of Harry in Lithgow, refers to his preference to be remembered as a troublemaker. Whichever party was in office regarded Harry as trouble, he wrote. In that sense, Harry undertook his role with intellect, dignity, good nature and humour, sometimes through only very small procedural measures whose impact took substantial time to eventuate, and many of which we still see at work today. His work has underpinned the modern Senate. A troublemaking chamber in the best sense, which provides a check, oversight and representation that our country and Parliament would be far weaker without, and that undoubtedly makes our liberal democracy stronger. Thank you.
We do have some time for some questions. Thank you, Scott, for that great lecture. I'm not too triggered by some of the occasions that you and I did have to talk to some of those officials. That was a really thought-provoking lecture, and one that we will be drawing on for years to come, I dare say. There's some time for questions. There's some microphones at either side. If you put your hand up, as we have a hand up here, the microphone will be brought to you. Come on down to Dr. Lang in the front for the next question, please, Carol.
Thank you very much. Kim Rubenstein from the University of Canberra and ANU and UTS. Thank you very much, Scott, if I may, for your far-reaching, very well-researched and substantial lecture. I'm wanting to push you a little bit more on the slight criticism I detected in your discussion about the decisions by the executive to prevent Parliament from meeting here in the ACT and the tension there between the absolute centrality of Parliament as representing the people and decisions that impacted on Parliament being able to do that. Because I wonder if we need to unpack the concept of the executive in that context. That surely there's the executive in relation to those who make the majority in government, but then there are also the independent members of the public service who are the executive, who were given charge, chief medical officers, of making those determinations for each of the territory. And one of the things that I think was perhaps strong about that period is the depoliticisation of those health decisions by being placed in independent executive decision makers as opposed to partisan executive decision makers. So I'm curious about that on one level, and given the fact that there was the capacity for members of Parliament to participate remotely, and even though that's not ideal, the sense of ideal becomes much more complicated when you're balancing such substantial health and personal risks. So I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
So I tried to refer to executive and officials to try and cover the field on that, because I do appreciate there's a difference. The executive being elected officials, elected office holders, ministers, officials being people working under various acts. And in different states and territories, it was different people. I think in South Australia and Tasmania, it was a police commissioner who was issuing the public health orders or control orders, and in Victoria, it was the chief health officer. I would challenge you, though, on the view that it was a good idea to have officials making such contentious decisions. Democracy is not just about 51% winning. There was always a large group of people who were very uncomfortable. Sometimes started at about 20% and then got larger, particularly in my home state. I think we met once in Melbourne, debated Section 18C, I think, of the Racial Discrimination Act many years ago. And they became less and less popular over time. So I'm not suggesting that elected officials should always make them. What I am saying, though, is that you cannot have a situation where the only place, when these extreme orders, particularly in the state of Victoria, the only place they can be questioned is in a parliament. The state parliaments sat under much greater restrictions than the federal parliament, even though they didn't have the same travel risks. You need to be able to undertake interrogation, questioning of all decisions of the executive and officials. I mean, that's one of the reasons our estimates process is so unique, because we have officials there. And so I wouldn't necessarily describe it as non-partisan in the sense that I would describe it as officials were making decisions they were given to by Parliament under various acts of Parliament. And they were all working very hard. And I should say, they were all generally acting in good faith. There were some very tense moments with some. And it was a very difficult time. But in moments of crisis, we do tend to run to the executive, and I've said that's a complaint from left or right, no matter who's in opposition at the time. And so I think it is absolutely critical that we set some ground rules that again ensure if there are that level of extraordinary restrictions being posed on individual liberties that we have taken for granted. And there was not a lot of awareness of them, I've got to say, outside Victoria, unless you were from Victoria, as I was. We came to Canberra in August 2020 for Parliament, and I'm sure Bridget will agree with me, most people had no idea what was happening in Melbourne. If the Parliament is going to serve any purpose, and by the way, if it is actually going to faithfully represent all people, then even minorities have to have their view. And there were minorities at the time that were very uncomfortable with those restrictions, and an inadvertent restriction on the Parliament's ability to interrogate them, that would be a significant diminution in the independence of our Parliament.
Apparently the microphone just works. Magic. Got a question from Rosemary Lang.
Thank you. Perhaps not so much a question as a comment. And what a terrific lecture. And in your new position as adjunct professor at University of Canberra, I can see you editing a book on this, because there are so many different aspects to the questions you've raised today. I mean, there's the procedural account of what happened and how parliaments did meet, not just here in Canberra but elsewhere. There are the the legal issues, the rights and responsibilities of office holders in the executive, whether they're elected or what have you. So, that's your new project. This is a book.
That'll be the last time I mention COVID, it triggers me.
And there are lots of people to contribute. So, anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks,
for
Rosemary.
a wonderful lecture.
My former boss always very good at giving me homework, so it's good to see. We do have time for some other questions. We have one over here.
This again is more of a comment than a question. I congratulate you on your speech today, but something you said at the beginning really raised my hackles. Your quick dismissal of the dismissal as being not a national crisis really doesn't sit well with me, and I disagree strongly. I believe it's the greatest constitutional crisis that this country's faced, and it was handled appallingly. And I disagree strongly with your comments that it was resolved constitutionally, particularly and where well-established conventions were ignored, particularly the Governor-General in not accepting the advice of his Prime Minister, and the failure of the Speaker of the House to acknowledge the vote of no confidence in the newly appointed Prime Minister. So, not surprisingly, we probably need to agree to disagree over that.
I think we will have to do that.
All I will, in quick two-sentence response, I did say it was resolved electorally, that rather than and the second thing I'll say is only that just does illustrate the other point I made, which is these matters are still contested.
And if you want to hear more about the dismissal you're speaking
There's
at...
a big event at Old Parliament House all day Tuesday, which I'm at. There's a whole series of panels. I think you can stream it if you can't attend.
50 years. Yeah. We have a question.
I figure I'm going to be in the minority.
You'll be on opposite sides.
We have a question from Senator Mackenzie.
Thanks, Scott. Great to have you back and lovely to see you, Rosemary. What a wonderful description of incredible times. I do recall as a party leader having those debates around the procedure to conduct the Senate, whether we would be allowing votes online or in person. And I'm so glad we landed where we did. And even this week, the Senate is its own unique beast, and unless you sit in it and study it, it's hard sometimes to understand what's happening on the floor of the chamber at any given time. But The fact that you're rocking up and having to deliver your vote, you see people's minds being changed by debates, deals being done, things change in a moment that just would not be able to be achieved if we had the New Zealand system where you just give your vote to the whip on your way through the door. So I firstly want to understand, do you think that will hold? And, you know, I'm a little old school, you know, small c conservative. I'm frustrated by the fact that we allow online participation now that the COVID restrictions are no longer with us in committee in particular. And I'm just wondering, is there a sunset clause on online participation in Senate committees?
Well, Senate committees have allowed effectively online participation since, I think, 1997, when phone participation was allowed for senators. I think that's when the Procedure Committee, if my memory of reading through all the reports yesterday is correct, it's late 90s, but it wasn't ideal, like I mentioned. I don't have as much of a problem with it with committees, partly because it's great that our committees can travel, and if you can get another voice at the committee for a few hours to hear something, as well as ask a question, I think that's good. Committees they deliberate in private, but they are more hearings. When it comes to Parliament, I'm a strong believer in, yes, I'm 52, so I might be a dinosaur, that the whole point of Parliament is to assemble. What I saw in Canada, like the idea that if I was a Canadian MP, I could literally, my phone could go beep, we all go over, you do your facial recognition, there's bunches of them, and you vote. And I just don't think that contributes to the standing of Parliament. I think it would also, it could do two things. It could weaken party discipline, it could strengthen it, but both in negative ways simultaneously, where people just slavishly adopt a whip vote, or you adopt the New Zealand model where the whip stands up and says, I have 60 votes, which I find phenomenally. Back in my first 17 months in the Senate, which was Harry's last 17 months, was the ETS debate, the CPRS debate, was very, very long. And there was a lot of floor crossing going on. It was a difficult time for the coalition then. I'll make no observation about now. But there was something to having to walk over and sit and your vote being identified. You couldn't do it in secret. There was a photo of you. You did it in front of your colleagues. And absent extraordinary measures, Parliament should be public. So I think there is something to that. And there were people that wanted remote participation, but that turns the place into a stage rather than a forum. And it's a forum for debate, and you do see people change their mind. And while crossing the floor doesn't happen often, you've got a large crossbench, and that can determine the outcome of every vote.
I think we have time for one more question, if we've got one more hand up. Going once, going twice. Well, we'll leave it there then.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott, for such a wide-ranging and insightful lecture. I do hope you can join us for our next lecture in the Senate Lecture Series on the 5th of December. We have presentations from former Senators Trish Crossan and Gary Humphries to commemorate the 50th anniversary of territory representation in the Senate. All right, that concludes our formal proceedings. Please join me again in thanking Scott Ryan.